Picture this, it's a dark street. The tense silence is broken by the sharp sound of a police siren. A police officer, fists clenched, stops a man, unaware that he's about to make the biggest mistake of his life. It all happens quickly: an unfair accusation, a burst of anger, and a punch. But a second later, his face turns pale as he realizes who he just hit: the mayor of the city. That moment changes everything. Write in the comments what is your name and where are you watching this video from. We want to know each of you, because you are our main inspiration. Every name, every comment helps to promote our channel, and we cannot express how important you are to us. We are grateful for your support, and without you this story would not have reached such resonance. Enjoy watching. The night was dull and unfriendly. The dim light of the street lamps seemed to be fading under the weight of the thick fog swirling over the empty streets of the city. The cold air cut into the lungs, and the rare passers-by hurried to hide in their homes, as if sensing something bad was coming. A police patrol slowly rolled down the street, illuminating the gray walls of the buildings with its headlights. Behind the wheel sat Officer Jackson, a man known at the station for his sharp tongue and uncompromising views. His narrow gaze, breaking through from under his low-pulled police cap, studied those around him with contempt, especially for those who, in his opinion, did not deserve to be here. Jackson did not hide his hatred. For him, the city was divided into two worlds, his and others, and that night he wanted to establish his order. He drove slowly, tensely peering into the faces of the rare passers-by, expecting to see someone who stood out from his narrow world. And then he saw him, a tall, handsome black man, striding confidently down the sidewalk in an expensive suit. Jackson immediately felt that flash of anger that rose up in him whenever he saw someone who, in his opinion, should not be on his territory. The officer did not know this man, but to Jackson it did not matter. He saw only what he wanted to see: an outsider who was too confident on the street, where, in Jackson's opinion, he did not belong. He turned on the siren, stopped the car abruptly, and quickly got out, slamming the door so loudly that it echoed down the street. Without saying a word, he moved toward the man, his eyes blazing with cold determination. The man looked too rich, too free, and Jackson couldn't stand it. "Hey, you!" he called out roughly as he approached. The man stopped, surprised, and turned to him, frowning politely. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked calmly, his voice firm and confident, betraying neither fear nor irritation. But that only made Jackson angrier. Who was this man to talk to him like that? The policeman, full of prejudice, did not bother to consider who he was dealing with. To him, this man was just another one who needed to be put in his place. "Show me your papers," Jackson barked, coming too close, his hand instinctively on his baton. The man frowned slightly, but calmly took out the papers. At that moment, passers-by, if they had been nearby, could have felt the tension in the air, as if time had stopped before the inevitable. When the man handed over the papers, Jackson grabbed them as if he wanted to rip them. He didn't even glance at the contents. He didn't need the papers, didn't need the explanations. In his mind, filled with hatred, he was already imagining how this outsider should be humiliated. "And who are you to walk around like a king?" he muttered, pushing the man in the chest. And then it all happened too fast. The man tried to pull away, not wanting to get into a fight, but Jackson, furious and consumed by his own racist prejudices, took the movement as a challenge. His fist, tight and rough, shot through the air and hit the man in the face. The moment seemed to last forever. The blow was strong, unexpected, and the man staggered, momentarily losing his balance. The world around him seemed to freeze. Blood pounded in Jackson's ears. His breathing became heavy, and he looked at his victim with a sense of victory. But then something strange happened. The man, wiping blood from his lips, slowly rose to his feet and looked at Jackson. There was no fear in his eyes. There wasn't even the rage Jackson had expected. Instead, there was confidence in his eyes, and it was disconcerting. This man didn't look defeated, as was usually the case with those Jackson had put in their place. Suddenly, the police radio in the car crackled to life and the dispatcher's anxious voice came over the speaker. "All units, attention, this is the mayor of the city. Attention, everyone, report immediately." Jackson looked away from the radio for a moment, then back to the man in front of him. His hand began to shake, and he felt a cold sweat start to trickle down his back. Something clicked in his head. That suit, that confident posture, That voice on the radio. Officer Jackson stood there, breathing heavily, his fists still clenched in rage, but at that moment, his anger began to give way to a strange feeling that he couldn't immediately recognize. Fear, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time, suddenly washed over him like a cold wave. The man in front of him straightened up, showing no sign of fear or confusion, as if even after the blow he was still in control. The man's face was bleeding slightly, but he wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth with a restrained, dignified gesture. There was none of the submissiveness in his eyes that Jackson was accustomed to seeing in those he had put in their place, and it was so unexpected that for a second Jackson himself froze, not understanding what was happening. A call on the police radio distracted him again. The dispatcher's voice was tense and clear. "All units, I repeat, the mayor of the city is in danger. He disappeared from the sight of his guards several minutes ago. Be extremely careful." The mayor of the city. The words echoed in Jackson's head, and he couldn't help but look at the man he had just hit. Slowly, it began to dawn on him that something was very wrong here. That confident look, that expensive suit, that lack of fear. There could only be one explanation, but his mind refused to accept it right away. "Something wrong, officer." The man's voice had been calm, but now there was a steely edge to it. It was not the voice of an ordinary man. There was a power and confidence in it that money could not buy, or give you birth. This man was used to being respected, used to his word meaning something. Jackson felt his legs buckle, but his pride and natural aggression wouldn't let him retreat right away. He took a step forward, trying to maintain at least a shadow of his former confidence. "Who are you to talk to me like that?" His voice thundered, but now there was a sense of uncertainty in it. He pulled out his baton, as if this gesture could give him back control of the situation. The man didn't back down. His gaze became even colder, and as if anticipating Jackson's every move, he slowly said, "Do you really want to know who I am?" The words sounded dangerously calm. The man slowly took his phone out of the inside pocket of his jacket and dialed a short number. "This is the mayor of the city. Yes, I was just stopped and hit by one of your officers. I demand immediate action." The words hit Jackson like a hammer. The mayor. This man was the mayor of the city. Jackson took a step back, his hands visibly shaking. He felt an icy chill run through his body. His mind raced, trying to find some excuse, some explanation for what had just happened. But nothing came to mind. He had just hit a man who was not just a citizen, not just a black man, as he had first thought. This was the mayor of the city, the man who held all the power in his hands. Jackson could lose everything, his job, his reputation, even his freedom. With every second that he stood there in shock, the realization of the catastrophe became clearer. Meanwhile, the mayor's voice remained calm, but his cool, measured words were filled with an anger that could destroy anyone's career. "Do you know what it means to assault a public official?" "Officer," he said quietly, not raising his voice, but every word cut through Jackson's mind like the tip of a knife. "It was a mistake," Jackson muttered, taking a step back. His confidence had evaporated like smoke. He knew he was no longer in control, that every word and action he took could only make things worse. "I didn't know who you were. It was a mistake." But the mayor kept his eyes on him, his face impassive. He had already made the call, and now all that depended on Jackson was how quickly his life would fall apart. There was no way out. Jackson stood there, a shudder running through his body, but the adrenaline kept him from retreating completely. His fists continued to clench, even though he was already aware of how deeply he was in this situation. The mayor, not taking his cold gaze off him, slowly put the phone back in his pocket. In the silence that followed, it seemed as if even the city was waiting. "Wrong, you say?" the mayor said slowly, his voice controlled but already brimming with anger. "Wrong for hitting me, or wrong for not being the one you wanted to humiliate?" He took a step forward, and Jackson instinctively stepped back, tripping over the curb. His hands were frantically trying to find some way out, but the situation was clear as day. He had lost. "You think you can treat someone you don't like that way, officer?" the mayor continued. "People who don't look the way you want them to. People who don't fit your limited idea of who has a right to walk down this street." Jackson, still stunned by his own actions, tried to object, his voice shaking, but still holding some of his former arrogance. "You don't understand. I was just doing my job. You were acting suspicious." The mayor narrowed his eyes. "Suspicious?" His voice turned icy. "Because I'm black and walking down the street in a suit?" He took another step forward, giving Jackson no room to retreat. "Is that all you needed to attack me?" Jackson hesitated, his face flushed with shame and fear. He tried to speak, but his words were drowned out by the hum of his thoughts, which revolved around only one thing: how could it all have gone so far? "I didn't know," he muttered, his eyes darting around, as if he was looking for someone who could pull him out of this trap. But the street was empty. No one would come to his aid. "You didn't know I was the mayor?" The mayor pressed, his voice now not just cold, but piercingly sharp, like an icy wind. "But if I were an ordinary person, you would still hit me, right? Because in your eyes, I'm not a person, I'm just the color of my skin." Jackson was silent. The mayor's words pierced him like needles, each one tearing at his sense of superiority and leaving only fear and shame. He knew he could no longer justify himself. Every word he spoke was empty now. He knew he had lost the moment he allowed his hatred to take over. The mayor, sensing his turmoil, held on to the situation. He looked at Jackson the way you would look at someone who deserved not just punishment, but a lesson. "You wanted to humiliate me," he continued, his voice calm again, but each time he spoke, the words came out like an accusation. "You wanted me to be afraid. You wanted me to feel worthless. And all because there was no room in your world for people like me. But what do you feel now, officer? Do you feel that same confidence? Do you feel superior?" Jackson couldn't answer anymore. He felt the ground beneath him literally wash away. Humiliation was spreading through his body, digging deeper with every word the mayor said. I just, he began, but the mayor cut him off. "You just, what?" the mayor said sharply, and his words were like a whiplash. "Just doing your job? Just thinking you could hide your hatred behind a uniform and a badge? You didn't think you'd be held accountable for it? Now look at you." Jackson stood silently, feeling his own pride crumble. He had always believed that power and a badge gave him the right to judge people by his own rules. But now, standing before him, was a man who would not allow him to do so. And the worst part was the realization that his actions were not just a mistake. They were the manifestation of a deep, painful injustice that Jackson had harbored for far too long. The mayor was silent for a moment, and then his voice became even quieter, almost threatening. "You wanted to humiliate me, officer. You wanted me to feel inferior. But now you stand here, and who is humiliated? Who is now on his knees before the truth?" Jackson felt the ground beneath him shake. He knew his career was over. He might even face trial, but the worst thing was the realization that his false sense of superiority had ruined not only his life, but the lives of others. Jackson stood frozen on the sidewalk. His mind refused to accept what was happening, but every word the mayor said was right on target. His old self-righteousness was collapsing like a house of cards. The mayor's words pounded loudly in his head. Who's humiliated now? He knew he had no answer. The mayor took a step closer, his figure looming over Jackson, who seemed to shrink under an invisible pressure. This wasn't just a man anymore. This was power, a force Jackson would never be able to control. There was a threat in the dark air, not physical, but something far worse, a threat that his entire life would be destroyed. "You thought your badge was a shield?" The mayor spoke again, his voice low and calm, but that only made it more frightening. "You thought your uniform gave you the right to do anything? But that badge doesn't protect you, Jackson. Today, you're going to be held accountable for your actions, and you have nowhere to run." Jackson swallowed, his fingers instinctively tightening around the baton, but it was no longer a weapon of power, just a piece of useless metal and wood. He knew the mayor was right, the badge wouldn't save him anymore. With each passing second, the mayor seemed to grow taller and stronger, and Jackson felt smaller, his former pride reduced to pitiful remnants. "You don't understand," he said quietly, desperately trying to find some kind of justification. His voice was weak, as if he knew every word was a lie. I just wanted." The mayor raised his hand, cutting him off. "You just wanted to what? Humiliate me? Or hit me because you thought I was nothing?" His words were calm, but there was a simmering rage beneath them, contained yet destructive, like an ocean hiding a storm beneath the surface. "You didn't care who I was. All you saw was the color of my skin, and that was enough for you to decide I'm not human." "No, you're wrong," Jackson cried out, feeling the fear take hold of him more and more. He tried to resist, to hold on to the power that was slipping away from him, but his voice sounded weak, as if it were just a pathetic cry for help. "It's not like that." The mayor looked at him with cold contempt. "Not so? Are you saying that I misunderstood your actions? That this was not a manifestation of your hatred, your contempt for me and everyone like me? Jackson felt his heart tighten. The world around him had narrowed to this one moment, this conversation. All his decisions, his entire life, depended on what he said, but every answer felt wrong. Every word he said only made things worse. The mayor leaned in slowly, his face now only inches from Jackson's. "You hit me," he said quietly, almost a whisper, but each word was like a stone falling into a well. "You hit me because you thought you could hide it, because you thought you could get away with it." Jackson shuddered, his fear turning into sheer terror. He suddenly felt a chill run through his entire body. He wanted to run away, to disappear from this place as quickly as possible, but his feet seemed rooted to the ground. I didn't mean to," he muttered, his voice shaking with despair. He looked at the mayor like a man who realizes he's on the edge of a cliff, and that one wrong step would be enough to send his life careening into the abyss. It was a mistake. The mistake was allowing yourself to think you could live the way you always had. The mayor snapped, his eyes glittering in the dim light of the streetlights. The mistake was thinking your hatred and prejudice wouldn't have consequences. The silence hung in the air, cold and heavy. Jackson felt his mind shrink under the weight of it. He saw the future: lost job, disgrace, trial, possibly jail time. His life, the life he had grown so accustomed to, crumbling before his eyes. And then, at that moment, the face of his wife and children suddenly appeared before his mind's eye. How would they look at him? What would they say when they learned that he had become a symbol of hatred and racism? Something inside Jackson snapped, and he felt a lump rise in his throat. "Please," his voice shook like never before. For the first time, he realized how powerless he was. "Please, I beg you, don't do this. I didn't mean to." The mayor straightened up and looked down at him as if he were a worthless man who had lost all respect and dignity. "You didn't mean to?" he asked coldly, his voice devoid of sympathy. "But you did it, and now you're afraid you'll have to answer for your actions." Jackson felt the world around him shrink. Darkness seemed to envelop his mind, and all that was left was the fear of the inevitable. Every word the mayor said pierced his consciousness, plunging him into despair. Jackson could no longer control his thoughts or the fear that was taking hold of him. He felt like he was drowning, and with every word the mayor said, every piercing look, he sank deeper. But despite the internal struggle, something dark and suppressed suddenly burst forth. That anger, that hatred that he had kept under control for years, suddenly flared up again, like a last desperate attempt to retain power. "Who the hell are you?" Jackson snapped, his voice ringing with desperation and aggression. He took a step forward, his face twisted in rage. "You think you're better than me just because you're mayor? You were elected by the people because someone decided it was time to show that black people could stand on equal terms with us? You just got lucky. But to me, you're still the same insignificant guy on the street as the rest of you." The mayor remained where he was, but his eyes narrowed. He said nothing, allowing Jackson to continue, the tension growing with each insult. "You thought that this suit made you a man? That your power gave you the right? But you know what? In my world, you're a nobody. You're a nobody who got his job out of pity. You're black, and you'll always be black, and therefore second class." Jackson was skating on thin ice, but it felt like his hatred had given him back control, at least the illusion of power. He swung his baton, as if he was going to strike again. "You thought your blood was different just because you were the mayor?" But the next moment, something happened that Jackson had not expected. The mayor, who had only been listening until then, suddenly grabbed the baton. He was faster than Jackson could have imagined. The mayor's gaze was icy, but there was a fierce fire behind it. The baton slipped from the policeman's hands before he could even comprehend what was happening, and was now in the mayor's hands. A heavy, ringing silence hung between them. "You think you can talk to me like that?" the mayor asked quietly, holding his baton tightly. His voice was so powerful that the air around him seemed electric. "You think your hatred gives you the right to do all this?" The mayor stepped forward, his face showing no anger or fear, only endless, cold confidence. How many of your kind thought they could beat, humiliate, and trample on those who were different? Jackson began to back away, but now the mayor was the one calling the shots. He took another step, getting closer with every word. "You hate me just because I exist, just because I remind you that your power won't last forever. But what you don't understand is that I don't fear you." His words were harsh, but calm. In his hands, the baton now seemed like a symbol of what Jackson had lost: control and power. You used to think that the badge gave you the right to decide who deserves life and who deserves humiliation. The mayor swung his baton as if to hit Jackson, but stopped at the last moment, causing the policeman to instinctively cower. But your power is an illusion, and today, your illusion was shattered. Jackson stood there, shaking with fear and shame. His face was flushed as if he had been slapped. All his words, all his insults, all his actions had been shattered against the rock of the mayor's calm and firmness. He felt completely helpless. "You can't do this. You don't have the right," he finally managed to say, but there was not an ounce of confidence left in his voice. "Right?" The mayor barely chuckled. "And you had the right to hit me? To insult me just because I'm standing here in front of you? You think the law protects you because you're white and I'm not? But today, you're not safe behind your badge." Jackson stepped back again, his back touching the cold wall. He was trapped. There was fear in the air, a suppressed aggression he could no longer control. Suddenly, the mayor took another step forward, the baton in his hands tightening. Jackson saw something in his eyes he had never expected: icy determination. "You've been beating up people like me for years," the mayor continued, his voice firm and confident, as if he'd finally broken free of whatever shackles had been holding him back. "You thought you could humiliate us however you wanted, that there would be no consequences for your actions. But today, you were wrong. Today, you weren't just dealing with a man, you were dealing with the truth." Jackson felt a cold sweat run down his back. The mayor was right. Too many times in his life had he used his power to oppress. Too many times had he believed he could humiliate people because they didn't live up to his idea of what was worthy. But here was a man who hadn't let himself be broken. "What is it, Jackson?" The mayor paused, his voice calm again, but there was a threat in that calm. "You wanted to hit me again? You thought you could break me like you broke the others?" Jackson was silent. He knew he had lost. Jackson stood before the mayor, his eyes blazing with rage that mixed with the hatred that burned inside him. The mayor's words, his calm, his confidence, all of it only fueled the fire in Jackson's soul, pushing him to the edge of madness. The officer could no longer control himself. He felt his own hatred overpowering his reason. "You think you can talk to me like that just because you're wearing that suit?" Jackson clenched his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. "You don't know where your bloody place is." Suddenly he lunged forward, grabbing the mayor by the collar of his jacket and shoving him hard against the wall. The dull thud echoed through the empty street, and the mayor, though he kept his balance, felt a painful blow to his back. Jackson, taking a step back, swung his fist and slammed his fist into the mayor's face with fury. The dull thud rolled through the air. The mayor almost fell, but he stayed on his feet. Blood began to flow from his cut lip. "What? Not so brave when your power can't save you." "Ha!" Jackson shouted, his voice shaking with rage. He was completely blind with hatred, believing that he could destroy the man in front of him, just crush him like an insect. "I could throw you off the street like a dog, and no one would even blink." The mayor, despite the pain, looked at him with surprising composure. Blood continued to drip from his face, but there was no fear in his eyes, only contempt and deep understanding. Understanding how pathetic this man was, how stuck in his own prejudices and hatred. But the mayor said nothing. He just continued to stand before his tormentor, erect. This only made Jackson even angrier. He couldn't stand this silent resistance, this strength that came from the man he was trying to humiliate. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he yelled, grabbing the mayor by the shoulder and pushing him against the wall again. This time the mayor couldn't keep his balance and fell to the ground. Jackson lifted his foot and kicked him hard in the side, hearing the muffled groan of pain that finally escaped the mayor's lips. "See? That's where you belong." Jackson continued to scream, his breathing becoming ragged like that of a cornered animal. He kicked the mayor again, who was now lying on the cold asphalt. "You will never be equal. You will always be insignificant, even with this damn suit on." The mayor tried to push himself up on his elbows, but Jackson hit him again, this time in the face, with such force that the mayor flew back several centimeters. Blood from his cut eyebrow poured into his eye, but he continued to look at Jackson. Despite all the pain, despite the blows, he did not lower his head. There was something in his gaze that Jackson could not bear. It was not only strength, but also contempt, as if the mayor was looking through him, seeing his petty, insignificant soul. "Why don't you give in?" Jackson suddenly croaked, his voice shaking. He didn't understand why this man continued to resist, why he couldn't give in to fear, why he couldn't be broken. "Why aren't you afraid?" The mayor finally spoke, breathing hard. His voice was weak. but there was a steel in it that Jackson could not break. "You cannot make me afraid," the mayor said quietly, his lips trembling but his eyes unwavering. "Your violence, your hatred, they are no stronger than my truth." Jackson froze in place, his fists still clenched, but now he felt his strength fading. The mayor's words cut through him like a knife, tearing at his self-righteousness. How could the man he had beaten and humiliated stand so proud and calm? How could his hatred be so powerless? "I am a man," the mayor continued, his voice growing stronger despite his wounds. "You can hit me, you can humiliate me, but you can never take away my dignity." The words threw Jackson off balance. His mind suddenly cleared of anger, leaving only shame and fear. He took a step back, realizing that he had lost everything. Jackson stood there, breathing hard, his fists still shaking with rage, but something inside him was beginning to fade. He couldn't understand why his blows weren't breaking the mayor, why every move he made to humiliate him didn't bring the expected result. The mayor, battered, bloodied, still looked at him with the same look, the look of a man who hadn't given up. "You will never understand." The mayor slowly rose to his knees, leaning against the wall, his face covered in blood and bruises, but his voice remained firm. "You will never understand that everything you do is just a manifestation of your weakness." Jackson felt the hatred boiling up inside him again, stronger than before. His hands began to shake, not from fear, but from helpless rage. He couldn't understand how the man he had just beaten half to death dared to look at him with such force. How could he still resist? "Shut up," Jackson shouted, grabbing the mayor by the lapels and pushing him against the wall again. The mayor didn't have time to stop himself, and his head hit the brickwork with a loud slam. "You have no right to look at me like that," Jackson growled, gripping the collar of the mayor's jacket so tightly that he could barely breathe. "You're nobody, understand? Nobody." He kicked the mayor in the stomach, and he fell to the ground again, gasping in pain. "You're just a black man, and you'll always be beneath me." But despite the blows, despite the pain, the mayor raised his head again. He was breathing hard, blood was streaming down his face, but his gaze was firm. "It is not you who decides who I am," he croaked. "You think that your hatred makes you strong? You are wrong. It is only your weakness." "Weakness?" Jackson seethed, his hands balling into fists as he raised them again, ready to strike again. "You dare to talk to me about weakness when you're lying at my feet?" The mayor looked up at him, his eyes glinting with pain, but there was more to them than that, an unbroken strength of spirit. "Yes, I speak of weakness, because a strong man will not humiliate another to prove his power. You are afraid, Jackson, afraid that your world is changing, that the people you used to consider beneath you are rising up." The words cut Jackson like a knife. He took a step back, his breathing even more ragged, his fists clenched even tighter. He couldn't let the mayor, this man, humiliate him with words as if he were his superior. "You think you can lecture me?" he shouted, leaning over the mayor again and grabbing his hair, roughly lifting his head. "You think I'm going to give you the right to talk to me like that?" The mayor closed his eyes in pain, but when he opened them again, his gaze was still as hard. "You can beat me, you can try to silence me, but the truth will not change." His voice was weak, but each word hit Jackson like a whip. "Your hatred is your slavery, and it is already destroying you." Jackson couldn't take it anymore. He hit the mayor again, and again, and again. His fist slammed into the mayor's face, blood splattering onto his own hands, but it didn't satisfy. Each blow he dealt only increased his despair. The mayor didn't scream, didn't beg for mercy. With each blow he only grew stronger, as if physical pain had no power over him. "Why don't you just give up?" Jackson screamed, almost choking on his own rage. His fists were already aching from the blows, but he kept throwing them again and again, not understanding why they couldn't break this man in front of him. The mayor looked up again, breathing hard. His face was bloodied, but his eyes gleamed with determination. "Because you will never make me afraid," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, but there was more power in that whisper than in Jackson's scream. "Your hatred is no stronger than my will." Those words were the last straw. Jackson, feeling something breaking inside him, abruptly let go of the mayor and took a few steps back. His breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling in a frantic rhythm. He looked at the mayor, who, despite all the blows, was trying to rise again. There was something wrong with this man. He should have broken down, should have begged for mercy, but he didn't. "You," "You're just a stubborn fool," Jackson finally managed to say, his voice shaking with anger and frustration. "You think you can beat me just by standing here and taking my punches? You're nothing. Black will always be black." The mayor staggered to his feet. He was breathing hard, his face bruised and bloody, but he was standing. "Again. You can say anything," he said slowly, the words straining through the pain. "But your time is running out, Jackson. People like you die with the hate they carry, and we live on." Jackson felt something dark boiling in his chest. More than just anger, it was desperation. The mayor's words, despite the pain, despite the humiliation, despite the blood, they hit him harder than any physical blow. There was a tension in the air, like a loud silence before a storm. Jackson, standing before the mayor, couldn't believe what was happening. His own words, the insults and put-downs, bounced off the mayor like a wall. Every punch, every kick he delivered seemed to strengthen the man's spirit. Jackson felt the madness rising within him. "You think you've won?" Jackson yelled, his voice exploding with anger. He lunged forward again, his fist slamming hard into the mayor's jaw. The mayor flew back, but to his surprise, he didn't fall. Instead, he turned, slowly, laboriously, but surely. His eyes met Jackson's, a fire burning in them that the cop couldn't bear. "You're nothing," Jackson screamed again, and this time his words sounded like a spell calling down darkness. "I'll show you what it's like to not know your place." And again, without waiting for an answer, he stepped toward the mayor, his heart pounding in unison with his rage. Jackson swung, his fist landing again and again on the mayor's face, each blow filling the street with a dull sound that sent shivers down the spines of the passers-by. Each blow from the mayor drew more blood, his face became more contorted, but he did not fall. He stood there, clenching his jaw, not wanting to show weakness. "You can't just stand here and take this," Jackson shouted again, his voice shaking with anger and fury. "You have to humiliate yourself. You have to be afraid of me. You are nothing." At that moment, the mayor finally gathered his strength, and despite the pain that was racking his body, he said, "You don't understand, Jackson. You are not stronger than me, and I am not afraid of you. Your hatred only highlights your weakness. You are killing yourself." That was the moment when Jackson, finally losing control, lunged forward again. "I'll kill you," he screamed, and grabbed the mayor by the throat. Squeezing hard, the policeman's fingers dug into the skin, and the mayor wheezed from lack of air. Jackson looked into his eyes, in which there was no longer pride, only boundless determination. "You don't even know what you're dealing with," Jackson growled, his voice shaking with hatred. "You don't know what fear is." But in response to this threat, the mayor, keeping his spirits up, said, "Fear is what you feel when you look in the mirror and see that you have become what you always hated." Those words were the last straw. Jackson, filled with rage, pushed the mayor to the ground and swung again, his fist hitting him in the face with such force that the mayor flew back. The blow was dull, and the mayor fell back onto the cold asphalt, his face shaking with pain, blood spurting from his cut lip again. "How many times do you have to fall to realize that you are nothing?" Jackson screamed again, his voice reflecting all the hatred he carried within him. "You thought you could stand up to me? You will always be inferior. You will always be a victim." The mayor, breathing heavily, tried to rise again. His face was bloody, but he did not give in. He looked at Jackson with an expression full of pain and pride at the same time. "You can beat me, but you will never be able to break my spirit. I am the mayor. I am a man, and I am not afraid of you." Jackson suddenly felt his inner world crumble. "You're so damn stubborn," he shouted, raising his fist again, but this time, as he was about to throw another punch, something changed in him. Fear, rage, and hatred fought inside him, and he didn't know what to do. "You can't break me," the mayor screamed, and his words, though weak, penetrated Jackson's defenses. "You never will." And suddenly, as if the whole world had stopped, Jackson froze in place, fist in the air, his breath suddenly stopping. In that moment, he realized that maybe he was the victim of his own hatred and fear, the victim who was killing himself. The mayor's gaze, full of pain, but also strength, made Jackson think. Something clicked in his mind, and he stepped back, lowering his hand with difficulty. Jackson felt something breaking inside him, and suddenly this horror, this hatred began to weaken, giving way to an unknown fear. But the mayor, struggling to his knees, continued to look at Jackson, his eyes not expressing hatred, but, on the contrary, genuine understanding. "You don't know what you're doing, Jackson," he said, his voice quiet but strong as steel. "You're just afraid of losing your power." At that moment, Jackson felt his world begin to crumble. He was a policeman, with a gun, with power, but now in front of him stood a man who not only was not afraid of him, but despite all the blows, continued to fight. Jackson stood there, trying to collect his thoughts. His fists were already aching from the blows he had taken, and the tension in the air was becoming unbearable. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready for the next move, but at the same time, something inside him was beginning to change. He looked at the mayor, who, despite all the humiliation and beatings, continued to look at him with a clear expression. "You can't just write me off," the mayor said, his voice weak but confident. "I'm not just a mayor, I'm the voice of the people you hate so much. I represent those who fight for their rights, for their freedom." Jackson couldn't believe his ears. These were words he didn't want to hear. He ran his sleeve across his forehead, wiping away the sweat, but instead left traces of blood. The hatred and anger he had for this man began to crack, and Jackson felt fear creeping up on him. "You think you can just come and tell me how to live my life?" he screamed, but there was no longer the same confidence in his voice. "I'm telling you the truth," the mayor replied, pressing his hand to his cut lip to stop the bleeding. "You can't kill me. You can't destroy my spirit. Every blow you deal only makes us stronger." Rage was boiling inside Jackson. He bit his lip, his thoughts racing. He didn't understand how this man, even with such a scarred face, could talk about strength. "I will destroy you," he roared, raising his fist again, but this time something inside him cracked. The mayor's words, his calm and confidence, were like hammers, smashing through the wall of hatred he had spent so long building. "Destroy? You can't destroy what's already destroyed," the mayor said, still on his knees, but his eyes were blazing with determination. "You've already lost. Your hatred, your cruelty, that's all you have. But that doesn't make you strong. It makes you weak." The tension grew with each passing minute. Jackson felt fear gripping his heart, and suddenly, instead of striking again, he hesitated. He couldn't bring himself to strike another blow at this man who didn't beg for mercy, but only continued to stand before him, proud and unperturbed. "You can't make me give up," the mayor shouted, and his words struck Jackson again. This was not just a statement. This was a real fight to remain a man. "My people do not give up, and neither will I." A struggle began inside Jackson. He didn't know what was happening. His hatred, his fear, his rage, all of it collided with a new force he didn't understand. Something inside him made him realize that this man was not an enemy, but an opponent who was fighting for justice, for equality. He felt lost in his own mind. "You don't understand," Jackson said, his voice shaking. "I'm just doing my job. I'm protecting this city from you, from your kind." "Work?" the mayor said, raising his eyebrows. "You're defending the city from who? From people who want justice? You're delusional. You're just defending your prejudices and your hatred. You're defending yourself." Jackson clutched his head, feeling panic rising in him. He was a cop, his life defined by his status, his power, but now he saw that his status meant nothing when standing before him was a man willing to fight for his dignity. "You will always be who you are, Jackson," the mayor continued, his voice quieter but every syllable laced with confidence. "You will always be a slave to your prejudices until you learn to see people for who they are, until you can tear yourself away from your hatred and fear." Suddenly, as if cut off from everything, Jackson felt a surge of rage again. He lunged at the mayor, and in that moment, as the world around them began to grow quiet, his fist met the mayor's face again. The blow was so strong that the mayor fell back to the pavement, and everything around him shook. "I'm still going to kill you," Jackson shouted, standing over him as if it was the only thing he could do. The mayor didn't answer. He just laughed quietly, and that laugh was full of bitterness and pain. He raised his hand, barely touching his face, but he still looked straight into Jackson's eyes, as if he knew that he was torn between hatred and fear. "You still don't understand," the mayor said, clenching his jaw to hold back tears. "You think physical strength is what makes a man strong? In fact, it is your desire for hatred that makes you weak. My strength is my faith, my willingness to fight for my people, for justice. You can kill me physically, but you will never kill my truth." Jackson froze, his fists shaking, his mind racing with emotions. He didn't know how to respond to those words. There was a sudden silence around him, and he felt fear creeping up on him again. The hatred that had been burning inside him began to fade, as if he were seeing that hatred in a mirror. You can't just give in," he said, no longer confident in his words. "You have to submit." "Submit?" The mayor chuckled, his smile bitter, but there was some confidence in it. "You don't understand. I will not submit to hatred. I will not submit to violence. I am a man, and I will fight to the end." Jackson felt something break inside him again. In that moment, he realized that all his hatred, all his violence, was just a reflection of his fear. He took a step back, unsure of what to do, and suddenly saw in the mayor's eyes not only defiance, but an unwavering strength that shocked him. "I'm not afraid of you," the mayor said, and that was the last straw. Jackson, torn between conflict and suppressed emotion, suddenly realized that this wasn't just a fight between them, it was a fight to understand each other. The moment Jackson took a step back, the mayor took advantage of the opportunity to rise to his feet. He was barely able to stand, but there was a fire in his eyes that could not be extinguished. He was ready to fight, ready for new challenges, and that was all that mattered now. "I will not let you win," the mayor said, and it became a mantra that echoed in the air. "You cannot break me. I am the voice that will never be silenced." The world around Jackson and the mayor seemed to freeze as the air was filled with silence, broken only by their heavy breathing. Pain, fear, and hatred mixed together, creating an atmosphere filled with tension that could be cut with a knife. Jackson felt a hurricane of emotions raging inside him, and he felt a cold sweat roll down his back. "You think you can win this?" Jackson said, his voice shaking, not knowing where the words were coming from. "You're pathetic. I'm the force, and I'll crush you like an insect." The mayor looked at him in bewilderment, as if he couldn't understand how anyone could be so mean. "You don't understand that you are just a plaything in the hands of your hatred. Do you think I am afraid of you? I see who you really are. I see that underneath that mask of anger there is a man who hates himself." The tension between them grew with each passing second. Jackson felt his heart pounding in his chest, clenching his fists. Fear was building inside him, fear that his life, his beliefs, everything he knew was being threatened. His hatred no longer seemed so strong as he looked at the mayor, who, despite the beating, stood tall and proud. "You shouldn't have come here, Mayor," Jackson shouted, but his words sounded more like a plea than a threat. "You think you can just stand up to me? I'm a cop. I run this city. You're just a target." "You don't run this city," the mayor replied calmly, his voice like a calm sea amidst a storm. "You're only trying to manage your fear, and it's that fear that makes you vulnerable." Jackson felt the coldness creeping through him again. He didn't want to hear it. He was a cop who always thought he was strong. But now, facing this truth, his strength was beginning to fade. Suddenly the mayor stepped forward, and the step came like a thunderclap. "You don't have to fear me, Jackson," he said, his voice full of confidence. "You have to fear yourself. You're the one who causes pain. You're the one who stirs up hatred and divides people. You're the one who actually lives in fear." Those were the words Jackson didn't want to hear. His insides pounded. He swung again, but the mayor stood before his eyes again as a symbol of resistance. "I will destroy you," he roared, his voice hoarse, and he prepared to strike again. But this time, something stopped him. His hand shook as he raised his fist, and he saw the mayor still looking at him with the same stoic expression. "You know I'm not just the mayor," he said, and there was such force in his voice that Jackson suddenly felt his confidence begin to crack. "You're not just fighting me," the mayor continued, every syllable of his voice dripping with truth. "You're fighting who you are. You're a cop, but you're also a human being, and there's a fear inside of you that you can't ignore." Jackson, gritting his teeth, took another step back. His heartbeat was increasing. There was a roar in his ears. "I'm not afraid," he shouted, but it already sounded like self-hypnosis. "I am the force. I am the order. I am the one who provides security." The mayor's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Security? You're just clinging to your sense of power like a straw in a storm. Your actions only serve to reinforce my point. Every time you raise your hand, you humiliate yourself, and every time you try to break me, you show how weak you are." The words struck Jackson like a sharp knife in his heart. He remembered how long it had been since he had slept, how often he had nightmares, how he had seen the faces of those he had knocked down. those who had asked for help but had instead been met with violence. His hatred now seemed unbearable, like a stone on his soul. "You have locked yourself in this prison of hate," the mayor said, his eyes shining like a lighthouse in a dark sea. "But I will not remain silent. I will not obey, and neither should you." Jackson felt something inside him crack. His world, his certainty that he was right, began to fall apart. He had never questioned why he acted the way he did, never thought about how his actions reflected his own fears. "I'm not like that," he whispered, although he didn't believe it himself. "I'm a policeman. I protect." "You have to be a man," the mayor replied, and there was a calmness in his voice that could break down any barriers. "You have to be someone who protects people, not people who use force to satisfy their fears. You're not just a police officer. You're a man, and you have a choice." At that moment, Jackson felt something in his chest break. Words he never wanted to hear started to ring in his head. He was on edge. He was afraid that he could lose everything he had, everything he had ever known. He didn't know what to do, and in that moment, fear enveloped him so much that he couldn't breathe. The mayor, sensing that the tension between them had reached its peak, stepped forward. "You are not alone. I can help you, but you must understand that everything you have done will not lead to victory. It is only a vicious circle of hatred." Jackson, standing there, felt a dull sound ripping from his chest. He didn't know if it was anger or fear, but he felt it was something more. It was his inner scream, tearing him apart from the inside. "I don't want to be who I've become," he screamed, and the scream echoed in the void. At that moment he realized that perhaps he himself had created this nightmare he was living in. He struggled with himself, and the fear of torment closed in around him like a dark cloud. "I don't know how to change this," he said, his voice growing weak. "The first step is to acknowledge your fears," the mayor said, his voice full of encouragement. "You have to choose who you want to be. You are not a monster. You are a human being, and you have the power to change your destiny." These words, spoken with such sincerity, seemed to free Jackson from a heavy burden. He felt his mind clearing, and a desire to change everything arose within him. But, at the same time, the fear of remaining himself still squeezed his heart. "What should I do?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "Take a step toward your humanity," the mayor said, his eyes shining with hope. "Open your heart, and you will see that there is more to the hate. There is love hidden behind the fear. I believe in you, Jackson." The words were like a balm on a wound. A struggle began inside him that could change everything. Courage. The moment Jackson and the mayor's hands met, the world around them began to crumble. Their hopeful looks turned to tension as they heard screams and the sound of a loud crash in the distance. It was a sound that brought Jackson back to reality. He realized that while they had been talking about change, a real storm had been brewing in the city. A crowd of people burst out of the nearby alley, and the stench of anger hung in the air. Jackson felt his heart begin to beat faster again. Terror gripped him. "What's going on?" he said, his voice shaking with fear. "It looks like they're going to protest against violence, against police brutality," the mayor said, his face turning pale. "But if they see us here, it could escalate the situation." "What if they don't understand?" Jackson asked, his voice filled with panic. "What if they see us as the enemy?" He felt his confidence begin to crumble, and fear began to take hold of him again. "We have to be careful," the mayor said, his eyes scanning the crowd where rage and hatred mixed like ink and water. "We could become a target if they think we're here to control them." As if to prove his point, shouts from the crowd came. "Get out! No more cops! We're tired of your lies!" Jackson felt his knees go weak. He wanted to be the one making a change. But what if this got out of hand? "What to do?" he asked, unable to hide the confusion in his voice. "How can we stop this?" "We have to go out to them and explain that we are on their side," the mayor said, striding forward confidently. "But we have to be careful. They may not understand." The crowd continued to gather, and Jackson knew the situation was getting tense. He looked at the mayor, and in his eyes he saw the same determination as before. But now the determination was mixed with anxiety. "I'm not sure this is a good idea," Jackson said, his voice shaking. "I feel like they might not understand us." "You have to be brave, Jackson," the mayor said. "This is the moment when we can make a difference. You have to be the one who shows there is hope." Jackson nodded slowly. He knew this was a chance to show that things could still change, but the fear still burned inside him. They stepped forward, and as they approached the crowd, the faces of the people began to express anger and hatred. "What are you doing here?" one of the protesters shouted, his voice full of rage. "You have no right to interfere." "We're here to hear you," the mayor shouted, his voice struggling to rise above the din. "We're on your side. We want change." The crowd froze for a moment, but then new cries rang out. "Liars! You have deceived us. You will not change anything." Jackson felt his heart pounding in his chest. He knew things were out of control. Hatred, anger, and fear were starting to boil over, and he saw people raising their hands, ready for action. "Get out of here!" someone shouted, and loud noises began to echo through the crowd. People began throwing things, and Jackson felt the tension build. "We have to go back," he said, desperation clenching his throat. "This won't work. They're not ready." "We cannot retreat," the mayor said, his voice full of determination. "We must fight for the truth, even if it is difficult. This is our time." But at that moment the crowd finally exploded. Someone threw a stone, and it flew past Jackson, crashing against the wall nearby. Hatred, fear and anger merged into a powerful stream that could no longer be stopped. Jackson felt his world begin to crumble. "They can't hear us," he shouted, trying to be heard over the noise. "We're just adding fuel to the fire." The crowd began to gather strength, and the shouts grew louder. "Break the system! Get rid of the cops! Don't let them crush us anymore!" they shouted, and Jackson realized that they were heading for a collision. "We have to go," he cried, his voice no longer so confident. "If we don't leave now, they might attack us." But the mayor, as if he hadn't heard him, looked into the eyes of the protesters. "We are here to serve you," he said, with desperation in his voice. "We are here to work for change." But the hatred in the people's eyes did not fade. Suddenly, someone from the crowd rushed forward and a cry rang out. "Get them out! Don't let them get away!" People began to move, and Jackson felt panic rising in him. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing the mayor's arm. "We have to get out of here." They turned and ran, but the crowd was already moving behind them, like a wave ready to swallow everything in its path. Every step Jackson took was filled with fear, and he felt the hatred of those he once considered allies growing. "Don't leave me!" the mayor shouted as they ran into an alley. "I have to keep talking to them." "You don't understand," Jackson replied, his heart pounding. "They're not ready to hear. We have to find a safe place." But at that moment, loud screams were heard behind them, and the crowd finally rushed after them. Jackson saw people approaching them, and the thought flashed through his mind that maybe they couldn't stop this hatred anymore. The crowd poured through the streets, and Jackson felt everything around him begin to crumble. He never thought that everything could change so much in a matter of minutes. His dreams of change, of peace, were suddenly on the verge of destruction. "What should we do?" he asked when they reached a dead end. "We have to be brave," the mayor said, his voice full of determination. "We have to show them that we understand their fears and their pain. I can't leave them in the shadow of hatred." But Jackson knew the world around them was descending into chaos. "You can't do this," he screamed, looking into the mayor's eyes, full of determination and fear. "This is madness." And then something terrible happened. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the crowd, and Jackson knew that this was only the beginning. He saw several people rushing towards them, ready to attack, and he didn't know how to stop this madness. "Run!" he shouted again, grabbing the mayor's hand, and they ran into a dark alley, but the noise behind them grew louder. The hatred, anger, and fear that Jackson had been trying to control were now beyond his control. Like a thickening fog, they filled every corner of his mind, and he understood that even if he survived, his life would never be the same again. Suddenly filled his heart, giving him strength he had never known he had. He looked into the mayor's eyes and felt his own prejudices begin to crumble like an old, cracked facade. This mayor, whom he had considered his enemy, suddenly became a symbol of hope and the possibility of change. I don't know where to begin," Jackson said, struggling to find the words. He felt tears welling up in his eyes, not from the pain, but from the realization that he could choose a different path. "Start with the simple: acknowledge your fears. They don't make you weak, they make you human," the mayor said, his voice full of understanding and support. "We all carry our own pain, but that's where we can find common ground." Jackson suddenly realized how long he had ignored his own fears. He had always tried to suppress them, to drown them in the hatred he took out on others. But now, looking at this man who was ready to stand up for his ideals, he felt that it was fear and hatred that had been the main obstacles to his freedom. I want to change, he said, and although his voice shook, there was sincerity in it. I don't want to be part of this system of hate anymore. That's a huge step, the mayor nodded, his face lighting up with hope. But remember, it won't be easy. All your past experiences will try to keep you on the same path. You must be prepared to fight not only against external enemies, but against yourself. Jackson felt anxiety creeping up on him. He didn't know how to do this. Fear was rising up inside him, and he felt the dark cloud of hatred creeping into his mind again. But what if I give in to that hatred again? What if I hit someone again? Then you'll learn and get back up, the mayor replied, his voice full of self-confidence. Nobody's perfect, and we all make mistakes. It's how you react to your mistakes that counts. You may fall, but that doesn't mean you can't get back up. Silence fell between them, and Jackson felt the fear slowly but surely begin to give way to hope. He tried to imagine a future where he would not cling to hatred and fear. In this future, he could be what he always wanted to be, a protector, not an executioner. How can I fix this? He asked, his voice growing more confident. How can I change my perception when my whole life has been built on fear and hatred? Start with the little things, the mayor replied, his eyes shining. Instead of seeing everyone as a threat, try to see them as people. Listen, talk, help. Start with communication, with simple steps, and you'll see how your view of the world changes. Jackson nodded, his thoughts beginning to come together. He realized that his job wasn't to punish and control, but to protect and serve. He was to be the one who found common ground, who helped in difficult times. But the fear was still there. Deep down, Jackson knew it wouldn't be easy. What about those who don't understand? Those who still hate? He asked, his voice still tinged with worry. These people are also victims of their own hatred, the mayor replied, but you can't change them unless you change yourself. Be an example. That's the only way. And remember, there are many people in this world who are ready to support you. You are not alone. Every word the mayor said seemed to help Jackson see a path he had never seen. He felt the darkness begin to recede, his fears losing their hold. In its place, a desire to fight for justice, for his life and the lives of others. I'm ready, Jackson said, his voice confident. I'm ready to try. Then let's get started. The mayor smiled. Now is our chance. Together we can change this city. Together we can show that hate and fear have no power. At that moment, Jackson felt a spark of hope ignite in his heart. He stepped forward and extended his hand. Let's do this together. The mayor took his hand, and there was more to the gesture than just a firm handshake. It was a promise to change, a promise to fight for peace and unity, a promise that hate would not win. And perhaps this was only the first step towards becoming a person who was able to understand, see and change the world around him. The moment Jackson and the mayor's hands met, the world around them began to crumble. Their hopeful looks turned to tension as screams and the sounds of a loud crash rang out in the distance. It was a sound that brought Jackson back to reality. He realized that while they had been talking about change, a real storm had been brewing in the city. A crowd of people burst out of the nearby alley, and the stench of anger hung in the air. Jackson felt his heart begin to beat faster again. Terror gripped him. "What's going on?" he said, his voice shaking with fear. "It looks like they're going to protest against violence, against police brutality," the mayor said, his face turning pale. "But if they see us here, it could escalate the situation." "What if they don't understand?" Jackson asked, his voice filled with panic. "What if they see us as the enemy?" He felt his confidence begin to crumble, and fear began to take hold of him again. "We have to be careful," the mayor said, his eyes scanning the crowd where rage and hatred mixed like ink and water. "We could become a target if they think we're here to control them." As if to prove his point, shouts from the crowd came, "Get out! No more cops! We're tired of your lies!" Jackson felt his knees go weak. He wanted to be the one making a change, but what if this got out of hand? "What to do?" he asked, unable to hide the confusion in his voice. "How can we stop this?" "We have to go out to them and explain that we are on their side," the mayor said, striding forward confidently. "But we have to be careful. They may not understand." The crowd continued to gather, and Jackson knew the situation was getting tense. He looked at the mayor, and in his eyes he saw the same determination as before, but now the determination was mixed with anxiety. "I'm not sure this is a good idea," Jackson said, his voice shaking. "I feel like they might not understand us." "You have to be brave, Jackson," the mayor said. "This is the moment when we can make a difference. You have to be the one who shows there is hope." Jackson nodded slowly. He knew this was a chance to show that things could still change, but the fear still burned inside him. They stepped forward, and as they approached the crowd, the faces of the people began to express anger and hatred. "What are you doing here?" one of the protesters shouted, his voice full of rage. "You have no right to interfere." "We're here to hear you," the mayor shouted, his voice struggling to rise above the din. "We're on your side. We want change." The crowd froze for a moment, but then new cries rang out. "Liars! You have deceived us! You will not change anything!" Jackson felt his heart pounding in his chest. He knew things were out of control. Hatred, anger, and fear were starting to boil over, and he saw people raising their hands, ready for action. "Get out of here!" someone shouted, and loud noises began to echo through the crowd. People began throwing things, and Jackson felt the tension build. "We have to go back," he said, desperation clenching his throat. "This won't work. They're not ready." "We cannot retreat," the mayor said, his voice full of determination. "We must fight for the truth, even if it is difficult. This is our time." But at that moment the crowd finally exploded. Someone threw a stone, and it flew past Jackson, crashing against the wall nearby. Hatred, fear and anger merged into a powerful stream that could no longer be stopped. Jackson felt his world begin to crumble. "They can't hear us," he shouted, trying to be heard over the noise. "We're just adding fuel to the fire." The crowd began to gather strength, and the shouts grew louder. "Break the system! Get rid of the cops! Don't let them crush us anymore!" they shouted, and Jackson realized that they were heading for a collision. "We have to go," he cried, his voice no longer so confident. "If we don't leave now, they might attack us." But the mayor, as if he hadn't heard him, looked into the eyes of the protesters. "We are here to serve you," he said, with desperation in his voice. "We are here to work for change." But the hatred in the people's eyes did not fade. Suddenly, someone from the crowd rushed forward and a cry rang out. "Get them out! Don't let them get away!" People began to move, and Jackson felt panic rising in him. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing the mayor's arm. "We have to get out of here." They turned and ran, but the crowd was already moving behind them, like a wave ready to swallow everything in its path. Every step Jackson took was filled with fear, and he felt the hatred of those he once considered allies growing. "Don't leave me!" the mayor shouted as they ran into an alley. "I have to keep talking to them." "You don't understand," Jackson replied, his heart pounding. "They're not ready to hear. We have to find a safe place." But at that moment, loud screams were heard behind them, and the crowd finally rushed after them. Jackson saw people approaching them, and the thought flashed through his mind that maybe they couldn't stop this hatred anymore. The crowd poured through the streets, and Jackson felt everything around him begin to crumble. He never thought that everything could change so much in a matter of minutes. His dreams of change, of peace, were suddenly on the verge of destruction. "What should we do?" he asked when they reached a dead end. "We have to be brave," the mayor said, his voice full of determination. "We have to show them that we understand their fears and their pain. I can't leave them in the shadow of hatred." But Jackson knew the world around them was descending into chaos. "You can't do this," he screamed, looking into the mayor's eyes, full of determination and fear. "This is madness." And then something terrible happened. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the crowd, and Jackson knew that this was only the beginning. He saw several people rushing towards them, ready to attack, and he didn't know how to stop this madness. "Run!" he shouted again, grabbing the mayor's hand, and they ran into a dark alley, but the noise behind them grew louder. The hatred, anger, and fear that Jackson had been trying to control were now beyond his control. Like a thickening fog, they filled every corner of his mind, and he understood that even if he survived, his life would never be the same again. The streetlights seemed too bright as Jackson and the mayor stumbled out of the alley, their hearts pounding in unison with their screams, which merged into one mad cacophony of hatred. The hatred emanating from the crowd seemed almost tangible, like a thick darkness that wrapped itself around them in a cold embrace. A group of protesters appeared ahead of them, blocking their escape. "Look, there they come!" one of them shouted, pointing at the mayor and Jackson. "These liars have come to deceive us again." "What are you doing here?" someone else shouted. "Do you think your words can calm us down? We are tired of your false promises." Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. Fear paralyzed him. Shouts of contempt erupted around him. The crowd surged toward them, and he instinctively stepped in front of the mayor, as if trying to protect him from the wrath he had once felt. "We're not against you," Jackson shouted, raising his hands frantically to try to calm the crowd. "We're here to help." But his words were met with derision. "You and your mayor are just part of the system," one protester shouted. "Nothing but oppression and hatred. We don't want your promises." Jackson felt the internal conflict boiling over. He had been there, on the wrong side, once part of a system he now hated, but now he stood next to a mayor who actually wanted change. But it didn't matter, the hatred had consumed everything. "You think you can just come here and say things are going to change?" The protester continued to shout, his voice full of contempt. "You're no better than that cop who beat us up." At that moment, Jackson felt an ominous chill envelop his soul. The hatred that had once been poured out on others was now being poured out on himself. He felt humiliated, his past catching up with him, and he didn't know how to deal with it. "I've changed," he cried, his voice breaking with emotion. "I'm not the same person I used to be." But the crowd only laughed louder at his words. "Changed? And what difference does that make? You're still a cop," one of them shouted. "You're just a tool of the system." At that moment, the mayor, full of determination, stepped forward, trying to speak to the crowd. "Listen, we are here to listen to you, to understand what you have been through. We are not the enemy." But his words were met with only fury. "Your words are worthless. Take him away. He is here to break us." The crowd began to approach, and Jackson felt fear grip his heart. "We have to go," he cried, grabbing the mayor's arm, but the mayor did not move. "I can't just walk away," he said anxiously. "I have to explain that we understand. We have to show them that change is possible." "You don't understand," Jackson screamed, his voice full of panic. "They don't want to listen. They want to see blood." At that moment, one of the protesters lunged forward, his face contorted with rage. "You think you can just show up and change something? You're just tools of racism. You don't belong here." He shoved the mayor, who nearly fell to his feet. "Enough!" Jackson shouted, his voice filled with anger. "This is not what we want." But instead of being heard, Jackson felt the hatred turn against him again. "Look at how stupid he is," someone shouted. "He thinks he can change anything just by being there." The crowd surrounded them. The screams grew louder, and Jackson felt panic fill him. "Please, we're here to help," he screamed, but his words were lost in the fury and contempt. "You are not wanted here," one protester shouted, his voice filled with hatred. "You are just a symbol of what we want to destroy." Jackson felt his heart breaking. All his dreams of change and hope had vanished into thin air. "You don't understand. I was on your side," he cried out in despair, but the hatred in the people's eyes was too strong. "You still don't understand us," shouted another. "You've never experienced the fear we experience every day." In that moment, Jackson remembered how full of hatred he had once been. He felt his own prejudices rising again, like a wave ready to engulf everything around him. He had become part of the system, and now it was coming back to haunt him. "You are all just toys in the hands of the system," the protester continued to shout. "You are not wanted here. Go away." And then Jackson saw one of the protesters step forward, ready to throw something heavy at them. "Let's show them who we are," he shouted, and the crowd wavered like a snake ready to strike. "Run!" Jackson yelled, pulling the mayor along with him. They turned and ran, but behind them came the sounds of anger and hatred. Jackson knew they were being chased, and he didn't know how to stop the wave. Every step he took was a reminder that he had once been a part of this chaos. He could still feel the hatred burning inside him like a hot flame, but he knew now that it would not help him. He had to find a way to escape this darkness, this humiliation. "We have to get away," he shouted, but in the mayor's eyes he saw a determination that belied his fear. "We can't just run away," the mayor said, his voice like thunder amidst the anger. "We have to show them we can do better." But Jackson knew that hatred consumed everything in its path. He remembered how he had been the one who had fueled that hatred, and now it was coming back to him. "We can't change anything if they kill us," he screamed, his voice filled with despair. The crowd was getting closer, and Jackson knew they were close to the edge of the abyss. He couldn't let that happen. "We have to stop and talk to them," he said, his voice growing quieter. "Maybe they'll realize we're not the enemy." But his words did not reach the mayor, who continued to walk forward. Suddenly, two men from the crowd appeared in front of them, their faces distorted with hatred. "Get him out," one of them shouted, and Jackson felt fear creeping up on him again. "You are not wanted here anymore," another shouted, his voice full of fury. "You have no place in our future." At that moment, when hatred filled everything around him, Jackson realized that the only thing he could do was try to regain control of his life. He had to find a way to change his destiny and, perhaps, the destiny of those around him. Clenching his fists, he looked into the mayor's eyes, and in that moment he saw that their fight for change was just beginning. They had to keep fighting, despite all the obstacles and hatred, even if it meant facing themselves. As the crowd grew heated, Jackson felt hatred brewing inside him like a volcano about to erupt. He tried to control his emotions, but the growing tension among the protesters left him no chance. Anger and fear intertwined like a cruel web, and he felt helpless. At that moment, a police officer stepped out of the crowd, someone Jackson had once known from his time on duty. It was Sergeant Hank, a man with a cruel expression and cold eyes. His reputation was known to all, a cop who was not afraid to use force, especially against black people. He was one of those who personified the racism that the city had fought against for so long. "Look who's here," one of the protesters shouted, pointing at Hank, another defender of the system. The crowd turned, and anger filled the air like waves on a raging sea. Hank stepped closer, his footsteps menacing. "What are you doing here, Mayor?" he said, his voice full of contempt. "You think you can come here and just calm us down? You're nothing more than a puppet in the hands of the system." The mayor, though determined, felt fear creeping up on him. "I'm here to listen to people," he said, his voice shaking but trying to remain confident. "I want to understand your problems and help you solve them." "Problems? You think we have problems?" Hank smirked, his face twisting into a wicked grimace. "Your words are just empty talk. You and your promises are nothing. I'm here to remind you that we are the ones who keep this system in check." In that moment, Jackson realized that this could be different. He felt anger begin to fill him, and he was ready to stand up for the mayor, even if it meant confronting the cop who had once been his friend. "Hank, we're not enemies," he shouted, trying to be heard over the noise. "We're here to sort things out." But Hank wasn't listening. He stepped forward, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You don't know who's boss here yet. Get out of here before I throw you out," he said, his voice full of menace. At that moment, the mayor stepped forward, his heart pounding with fear and determination. "We're not leaving until we make a difference," he said, trying to maintain his confidence. "We're on the side of the people." Hank just smirked, his eyes flashing with anger. "You think you can just show up and pretend you're on their side? You're just a black mayor in a white city," he shouted, his words ringing out in the air like thunder. And then, as if time stood still, Hank, without thinking, lunged forward. He hit the mayor in the face with such force that the mayor barely stayed on his feet. His head fell to the side, and blood came out from his lips. Jackson felt his world turn upside down. Anger flared in his eyes. "Hank, are you crazy?" he screamed, rushing forward to protect the mayor. "You have no right to treat him like that." But his words were met with only cries of hatred from the crowd. "There he is, the defender of the system. He can't even protect his own mayor," someone shouted, and the crowd, seeing the attack, roared in rage. "Look at him being humiliated," another protester shouted, pumping his fists in the air. "This is what we want to see, racism on display." At that moment, Jackson felt anger brewing inside him. "We won't let you do this," he screamed, ready to protect the mayor, even if it meant facing his own fear. But Hank, as if he didn't notice them, hit the mayor again, this time in the stomach, and the mayor fell to the ground. Out of breath, the crowd roared with delight, as if this was the spectacle they had been waiting for. "Look at him! No respect for authority," one protester shouted. "He thinks he can play with us." Jackson didn't know how to stop this madness. He knew the mayor was genuinely trying to make a difference, but now he was the victim of the same hatred they had both once faced. He looked at the mayor, who was sitting on the ground, his face twisted in pain and humiliation. "You don't know what you're doing," he shouted at Hank, who looked at the mayor with indifference. "You're fomenting hatred and humiliation. You're playing with fire." Hank just chuckled. "I do what needs to be done. No respect for liars," he said, and his words cut like a knife. Jackson felt his anger build to its limit. He stepped forward, ready to protect the mayor, even if it meant becoming the next victim. This is going to end. Hank, he screamed, his voice shaking with rage. You can't do this to him. We won't let you. But Hank just smirked, his eyes blazing with cruelty. You think you can stop me? You're nothing, he said, and with it he raised his fist again, ready to strike. Everything was heating up, hatred and fear woven together like dark threads, and Jackson knew this fight was just beginning. Every blow was not just a blow to the mayor, but a blow to hope, to the change they were trying to achieve. But now that the hatred was spilling out, he didn't know how to stop the madness. The crowd roared like a wild animal, waiting for the next act of violence. Jackson sensed that time was running out. This was a fight not just for the mayor, but for their own souls, and he had to find a way to confront this hatred before it consumed everything. The mayor, still sitting on the ground, realized the gravity of the moment. The pain of the blow pierced his body like 1,000 sharp needles, but the humiliation was even more acute. He felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he did not want to show weakness. Every breath was an effort, and he knew that his role today was not just to speak out against violence, but to inspire people, to show them that change was possible. The crowd screamed, furious and full of hatred. In their eyes, the mayor had become a symbol of everything they despised, the system that had once betrayed them. He knew that every scream, every derogatory word, was a reflection of their fear and pain, and it filled him with anger. But even in this darkness, he felt there was hope. I'm not just a mayor, he whispered, clenching his fists through his teeth. He rose to his feet despite his hesitation, and felt a flame of determination ignite within him. I'm your mayor. I'm here to hear your voices. You're suffering. He looked at the protesters, and in that moment his heart filled with compassion. I understand your pain. I understand your anger. We cannot change the past, but we can build the future together, he said, his voice confident, like a powerful thunder amidst the anger. The crowd froze, and then one by one they began asking questions. How can you understand? Someone shouted. What have you done for us? The mayor knew they were right. He knew his words had to carry weight. I'm not perfect. I'm here because I believe in change. I believe in you, he said, his eyes sparkling with determination. We can start here. I promise I'll work to make this city a better place for all of us. Let's stop the violence and the hatred. Let's start a dialogue. Jackson, standing next to him, felt hope rise in his heart. He knew the mayor was speaking from the heart, and it was sincere. At that moment, the anger and fear began to dissipate like fog, giving way to understanding and solidarity. Gradually, the protesters began to talk quietly, listening to the mayor's words. We're tired of the lies, one of them said, and others began to nod in agreement. But we want change. We want to be heard. The mayor, seeing how hatred gave way to hope, felt his heart fill with joy. He continued speaking, his voice becoming more confident. I promise you that I will work with you, and together we can change this city. This is our home, and we will not let it break us. Slowly but surely, the crowd began to disperse, their anger giving way to conversation. People approached the mayor, beginning to discuss their problems and pains. They began to open up, and this was the beginning of a dialogue that had remained impossible for so long. Despite everything that had happened, the mayor knew that his words had ignited a spark of hope. He was determined not to give up, but to continue the fight for a better future. This was not the end, but only the beginning of a new journey. In that moment, he felt the support of his people. Jackson, standing next to him, knew that together they could create change. Maybe that was true strength, the ability to unite in the face of hatred and fear. The mayor looked up, and a belief was born in his heart that even in the darkest hours, it was possible to see the light. In that moment, he realized that they could not only overcome hatred, but build something greater, a community based on love, understanding, and respect. And although the road ahead was long and difficult, they were ready to go through it together. The mayor smiled at the people gathered around him. Each of them, with their stories and hopes, was important, and together they represented a powerful force for change. It was a moment when hatred gave way to love and understanding, when fear faded into the background and it became clear that there was a brighter future ahead. The crowd, gradually calming down, began to discuss solutions to their problems. The mayor saw how the conversations lit sparks of hope in their eyes. Each of them became part of something bigger than just a protest. They began to form a community ready for change. Jackson, standing nearby, felt a surge of emotion. He knew the fight wasn't over, but in that moment they were all united. "We're going to do this together," he shouted, and the crowd shouted back, pumping their fists in the air. "Yes, we're going to do it." The mayor raised his hands, calling for silence. "Let's not let hate and violence break us. Together, we can create a place where our differences are valued, where every voice is heard. We can make our city a place where everyone is equal." The mayor's words had a powerful effect. People began to hug, forgiving each other for past mistakes. They exchanged stories and dreams, and this feeling of unity filled their hearts. Time passed, and real changes began to happen in the city. People came together and began to build new bridges of understanding. They organized meetings with government officials, launched community improvement projects, and created safe spaces to discuss pressing issues. The mayor, inspired by the support and determination of his people, continued his work, vowing never to forget where he came from. His heart was filled with pride for being part of this movement. A few months passed and the city hosted a unity festival where everyone could share their stories and experiences. People danced, laughed, and celebrated life, as if they had left all their fears and hatred behind. The mayor, standing on the stage and looking at the smiling faces, realized that they had really done it. Not only had they weathered the storm, but they had emerged stronger. This was not just the end of history, but a new beginning for their city. "We did it together," he shouted into the microphone, and the crowd exploded in applause, creating an atmosphere of unity and hope. In that moment, he realized that it was in unity and mutual understanding that the real power lay, capable of overcoming any obstacles. And so their story continued, not as a struggle against hatred, but as a triumph of love and understanding. It was a story of how one could overcome darkness, come together, and create a future where everyone was valued. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Let us know in the comments what you think. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? How did you deal with such situations? You are very important to us, and we appreciate each of you. Your votes help us grow and develop. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Have a nice day and look forward to seeing your comments.